in fact, that's exactly where we want to go next, is to focus on responsible AI and issues of ethics. We couldn't have planned it better. Thanks you for your questions, and Klaus's talk was a great setup. The check's in the mail, as they say. So today, to address these issues, it's my great pleasure to welcome up Sunita Kannan from Accenture. So Sunita has a background in technology and science. She was a quantum physics PhD. We rarely get those at INSEAD, so really terrific. And also holds, and that's from University of Colorado, Boulder, and also master's and undergrad from Wellesley College, where she focused on math and physics. And so Sunita focused and leads the ASEAN Applied Intelligence Advisory business at Accenture. And obviously, she's worked with a lot of companies working on these sorts of issues, Fortune 500 companies. So it'd be great to get her perspective on ethics, particularly when you're working with large organizations. So let's welcome up Sunita. Thank you.
This works. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Hi, can everyone hear me? All right, cool. So thank you for that. Just to correct a little bit, I was a PhD student at the University of Colorado in Boulder doing quantum physics. Why am I here? I have no idea, but here I am. So, well, I lead the advisory business, which is basically business analytics at Accenture in ASEAN. We look at everything to do with how data science actually supports the business in whatever that they're doing, and this is where I come in. Obviously, responsible AI, I've been hearing bits and pieces of it in every single presentation today. So hopefully you're not too bored by the time my presentation has come up. So here we go. So we all know that it's been mentioned that AI has started several years ago. But it has created the single biggest technology revolution in the world right now. What does that actually mean? Because now with the rise of AI being implemented left, right, and center, things are going out of whack, right? So basically that means that there are social implications, some of which we'll look at over here. And then I'll talk about how we could actually think about addressing some of those issues which have come up. I think the very first question, and the slide is irrelevant right now, but is to ask ourselves, what is artificial intelligence, right? We all know that technology deals with three different categories. Number one, sense, to be able to acquire, synthesize, analyze your data. Look at comprehend, to basically understand what that data is trying to say, derive insights out of that data, which can then be used to action on the data, right? So that's what we do. What artificial intelligence does, AI, basically, is to be able to learn from that, from that act and comprehension that you've done, and to be able to adapt and grow on its own. And I put that in quotations because nothing is on its own, right? I mean, it's the humans who are doing this. So this is what AI focuses on. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, there have been a lot more cases of ethical issues which have risen from AI being implemented without proper care. I can never say that word properly, but let me try. Job apocalypse. There we go. Yay. So basically, we have all heard that machines are going to take over humans' jobs. We're going to be jobless soon. We don't need to do anything. We've heard that managers are going to be obsolete. Well, not really obsolete, but getting there. That the machines can do pretty much everything that many things that the humans are doing currently. We've also heard that I don't really understand what's going on in this black box of AI. So let's be clear. Do I need to be a data scientist to know this? Do I have to be reskilled to become a data scientist to know exactly what my job, how to do my job? And the one thing which I hear a lot of as a consultant is I've been doing this job for 30 odd years, right? So are you telling me that a machine can come and do this as well as I do? And obviously we have the art of privacy laws, regulations, which you have to be in keeping with. What's going on with regard to things like in Singapore the PDPC with their data laws? How are we working with that to make sure that AI is not impeded by that? This then goes on to pose that we have to recreate the business value of AI, right? Which is not just dependent on process and data, but it's also dependent on humans. In fact, it needs to be centered at humans. So what I will then pause to say is that here is the introduction of what we have termed in Accenture as responsible AI, which is a whole load more than just ethical AI. And I'll go into the details in a bit. Responsible AI consists of 3 pillars, and not just limited to these, but the 3 main pillars, which is number 1, to have a design which looks at humans and how it's actually affecting those humans. Things like regulations, the board, things around the political and compliance issues, and to work with the legal teams, which we do at Accenture, to actually make sure that legal and innovation are shaking hands at this point to move forward. And obviously to create an ethical design, and here is where I'll go more into the topic of algorithmic bias. What does that mean? I think we've heard a bit about it before, but let's continue with that. So a design that considers its impact on people. Obviously we have labor laws and union laws where relevant. We need to be able to leverage whatever expertise is currently in the company with the workforce to be able to have them give that insight into how machines are going to progress with doing the same tasks. An example being, I have been in this field for many, 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 many years. There is a certain level of EQ which cannot be replaced. But what I can do is I can use a machine to generate some of the data with the IQ and give my insights or interpret the data or the results that come out of the data being a human being, right? So that's still possible. So how can we retrain and counsel our employees whose jobs have been impacted by the introduction of AI? So how can we reskill them, basically? And obviously there is a lot of emphasis on dangerous tasks or labor-intensive tasks. An example being a mining client, one of our mining clients, which actually has miners go down to do their job. Now, instead of that, can we have machines which are able to do that for us? Because it's a dangerous task. I mean, there are pros and cons, right? The pros being that you're not putting the human at a risk to that extent anymore. The con is that there is a certain level of, as I said, education that the person has had. Can we transfer that to the machine? And what does this mean for the workforce in general from the kind of insights that are generated? We have obviously the regulations and the compliance, as mentioned before. So we want to be very mindful of the fact that we're going to use, for instance, third-party data. What does that actually mean? So we deal with a lot with the financial institutions, insurance companies, healthcare. A lot of the data that they're going to be using are going to be extremely sensitive, right? So there is no question there that they're going to give us that sensitive data. So how do we work with that? We have to basically look at using mask data. Do we have to get every single person's name to be able to perform an analysis or get insights for a particular reason? Can we use the mask data to categorize and classify and then derive insights out of that, which could be the first step that you take to derive whatever insights you need to. Again, the education and awareness, I can't stress on that enough because it's extremely crucial that your workforce is aware of what's sensitive, what's not sensitive, so on and so forth. Let's look at another example. I think hiring and recruitment has been a big topic today as well, right? So for instance, if let's say that, a female in artificial intelligence, I take my own example, I get immediately flagged, right? So the thing is, it's a pro and a con. Because if I'm looking through CVs and I'm looking for a particular type of, a person, but I leave out gender, right, which is a sensitive variable. What happens there is, for instance, in the CV, there is a topic on, hobbies. So if I look at men's basketball being a particular hobby type, I don't have male or female as the gender types anymore, but men's basketball is related to men, right? So these kinds of things where you actually link sensitive variables to non-sensitive variables building the awareness in your organization to help them understand what these relationships are and how to deal with them, that's crucial. And obviously, we have our favorite topic, the algorithmic bias, right? And by algorithmic bias, we've heard before that algorithms cannot be the bias feature here, which is partly true. I mean, we have pre-algorithmic bias, which is data bias, information bias. We have algorithmic bias itself for the models, and that basically depends on how you actually weight each of the different variables that your model or algorithm is looking at. And then you have your post-algorithmic bias and how to use those algorithms in your organization moving forward. To then go on, just 1 second. So I have 2 examples here before I get into some facts that we performed, that we surveyed actually. One of them is on the topic of trans bodies, right? So this is an actual example where trans bodies were actually flagged because their physical appearance was not matching that of their personal documents or their IDs. This is obviously, I'm talking about a smaller population here, but then it's very much an ethical bias kind of situation here. So what the machine has basically done is, facial recognition, flag, based on bias data, which has been, taken from before. Then we have the very famous Amazon story. I won't get into that again, but this is where, it was recruitment, where they're trying to automate this. This is what happened based on their training data, which was biased, or their sampling, which was not correct. There's another example, which I do want to get into here, which is not on the slide, but it's basically to do with gang crimes, identification and predicting gang crimes in New Orleans, which was done a few years ago. What happened there? Again, a case of racial bias with the police, security police officers. Because of their inherent racial social bias, what happened is it started flagging a particular race as being responsible for gang crimes. That raised, obviously, quite a stir. There is a survey that Accenture actually recently did, which was very interesting in terms of the results we got back, and this is mainly in Singapore. Basically, what we found was that of the 300 plus professionals whom we had surveyed, which were mainly C-suite, over 90% of those professionals actually said that they had no idea of the unintended consequences of what AI could do, which was a very interesting fact because, if you think about it, we are implementing AI. We've heard a lot about AI, and yet there is a lot of unknown here. There is also, if I just pull back the facts just very quickly here, there was about 88% of the leaders who said that their workforce was ethically equipped, but only 30% agreed that the processes were in place when AI outputs became questionable. So if we look at the most recent example of Google's AI committee, which was brought down, it's a very interesting fact because even though a lot of professionals say, or a lot of companies say that they have an ethical committee there is a lot of uncertainty about what the tasks or roles and responsibilities of these ethical committees are. So that needs to be obviously, put in place. Well, I think ahead of time, but I think there's been a lot of, discussions on what are the unintended, consequences from the past of AI, what it's done, social implications. There's been a lot of emphasis here on, examples as well where it's gone wrong. But as said previously as well, if you didn't know it had gone wrong, you don't know what to change to make it go right. So some of those things over here, the 3 main pillars pointed here, are 3 things that you start with to actually make your AI systems more responsible in the future. Number 1, your organization, your culture. It's very crucial to make sure that they are ethically, and culturally aware of what ethics and responsible AI means. Number 2, regulations, obviously in keeping with legal regulations, compliance laws. And number 3, to be able to look at machines and algorithms and to make them more unbiased. So Again, this is pretty obvious. AI is everywhere around us in every single decision that we make and every single thought that we have. And the time to move to responsible AI is now. Thank you.
Let's take a few questions or comments. Back here. One back here. Right there.
Thank you for sharing very interesting inputs. There seems to be both in your presentation and also Klaus's before, almost an expectation that AI has to be flawless. So we cannot accept AI if it represents or sort of drives discrimination. Now, reality is that we're living in a world with a lot of discrimination. So are we not, to some extent, asking, you could say, too much from AI? Are we not asking that it delivers a perfect world where we're coming from a completely imperfect world? Would you have some perspectives on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think very good question. I would love to change the world and win the Nobel Peace Prize, but I think you're right. I mean, there is a lot of bias socially that needs to be addressed before we can, actually not before, but alongside moving into AI-based technologies in the company, to be addressing these things are very important. And I think from what's been discussed before and from this, you don't need it's just very interesting because organizations that we deal with, right, that I talk to right now are like, there's so much happening which is like wrong with AI right now. Are you sure like we are ready to go there? And the point is, do you have to wait for everything to be perfect before you can move to that? Or can you do two things at once and address it? What I'm trying to say is you don't only tackle ethical, like bias algorithms. You don't only tackle bias information. You don't only tackle those kinds of things to do with data science. You tackle the organization, the strategy, the governance, the committees being placed as well that can monitor these things if something fails. So you not only look for a perfect AI world, but you also look for things where you're forming all the backup plans ready just in case something fails. So no, I'm not waiting for a perfect world, but what I am advising my clients is that two things can happen at once, just in case, even before you have a near perfect organization, if something were to fall apart, you know how to deal with that.
Other question or comment?
Thank you. I've heard of the term audit committee. I've heard of the term remuneration committee, but this is the first time I've heard ethics committee. Yeah. Is this really a thing?
It's really a thing. Well, I think that's a very good question, right? Because when we found that 88% of the C-suite actually had an ethics committee in their organization, it made us really question, do they understand what an ethics committee does, right? Because the definition of an ethics committee is not just, it's not the same as audit. It's not the same as, your data science. This comprises, your data scientist, your chief data scientist. This comprises of, your legal team being there. This comprises of, all the relevant, the social people, the change managers, being there in one committee to actually address issues as they, before they happen, hopefully, but when they happen, immediately to correct for that. And I can't stress, like, even right now, like in Accenture, for example, we actually work very closely with the legal teams to make sure that when we're going into our clients, we have the legal team's presence there so that, everyone is not an expert in everything, right? That's granted. So this person who's with me is able to, give a legal perspective on data laws, on, governance laws, on, compliance issues. And the funny thing is, and that's why it falls into my realm within Accenture as well, because advisory is inclusive of responsible AI, right? So AI advisory, I can't go in and advise on anything in AI without touching on responsible AI and how to, implement AI responsibly. So it's very important to have all these right people in that committee, and the organizations that we talk to may already have that within their governance laws, may already have that. But it may not touch upon many of these issues specifically to do with ethical and explainable, interpretable AI, right? So that's a term.
Hi.
Hi.
Quick question. I wanted to have your views on algorithm auditing to identify and potentially remove the biases that you just mentioned.
Sure. So, so the other thing that, again, I go back to Accenture here, is that we actually have a tool, which allows you to be able to look at all the different touch points that you need to have to be able to, be responsible in your AI implementations. So that would include everything to do with, making sure your organization is intact. There are qualitative, quantitative aspects that we have to assess to be able to understand if, for audit purposes, to be able to get to a more responsible, auditable, responsible AI. So I don't know what views in particular you were looking.
My point was more, do you have any example of strong biases that you identified through that?
Sure. So I think, shocking example. I think the one thing which I will stress upon again, right, is from my own, I take my personal experience, for instance. There are times when you have, intended biases, and there are times when you have unintended biases, right? So if intentionally I need to put in a bias which is of this sort, then that's great. An unintended bias could be, as I mentioned before, which is in hobbies, I have, people who are flagged as netball. Things like men's basketball. Very contentious when it comes to soccer, for instance, because it's traditionally a men's game, but then now it's become, women are playing it, obviously. So things like that, which also brings in social biases. And then we started to see that there were a lot of, men being hired for a particular role, which was not supposed to be the thing. But the algorithms, the way it processed everything, was flagging all the hobbies, and it was actually favoring men's basketball. And again, that goes back to how you're actually programming or coding the algorithm, right? So it depends on the weightage that you have for the hobby. So what we did in that particular case was obviously distill, filter the hobbies, but also to make the algorithm more unbiased with regard to the amount of weightage that was applying to the hobbies. So to me, that's shocking because I'm a female in, again, AI. And I don't want to be flagged every single time as not being the one. So
I would maybe do one more. Okay, here we go.
Mine is pretty much attached to the previous conversation that you said 88% of C-suite, they're saying they have ethics committees, but your take, and I know it's a bit maybe unpolitically correct question, how many of them are functional?
Sorry?
How many of them are functional?
How many of them are functional?
Yeah.
Oh boy, can I not answer that question? Okay, so, well, I think I wouldn't put a number. I wouldn't be able to put a number. But what I can say is from our conversations with clients, right, it's very clear that there is a fear. There's an underlying fear amongst all the organizations, especially if you look at financial services. Banks, MAS is huge on, ethical AI and, promoting, and getting that awareness in place and everything. But when we still go to financial services, there are some who have started and embarked on this. There are others who are very interested. If you look at insurance companies, they're a lot more afraid of taking that first step. So it becomes very clear that, they may not have an ethics committee there because they're not aware of what that can do to eliminate some of these fears, right? So in my opinion, it's quite low. But again, that depends on what was interpreted in terms of the definition of ethics committee.
Okay, so can you give an example of the most advanced sector where it's actually functional?
Okay, again, I would say that just from my own knowledge and from my experience, knowing that MAS is doing this, financial services knows what they're doing much more than other industries with regard to this, right? So, but that again, it depends on the kind of support that they have, underlying support that they have or need from the government. So as these committees starts forming, as these different industries starts embarking on this, then it will be different, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, we're going to have to stop it there, but Sunita, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.